Some bands come along and they just define an era. But then there are the bands that completely shatter it. And for a few wild, chaotic years, one band managed to do both, leaving this beautiful trail of destruction behind them. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's talk about the story of Guns N' Roses. And when people called them the world's most dangerous band, look, that wasn't just some clever marketing slogan. No way. This was a reputation they earned. We're talking riots, addiction, a kind of volatility that felt like the whole thing could just explode at any given second. So that's the real question, right? How did this band go from the gritty streets of LA to literally the top of the world, only for it all to just go up in flames? That's what we're going to unpack. It's this incredible story of how talent, mixed with a whole lot of trauma, can create a masterpiece and then turn around and tear its creators to shreds. All right, first up, to really get their impact, you can't just think of them as another new band on the scene. Their arrival was, well, it was a rupture, a definitive break in the timeline of music. You had all this polished, hairsprayed, hyper-stylized glam metal dominating the 80s. And then, bam, Guns N' Roses shows up as this raw, gritty, authentic backlash to all of it. And the band itself was basically born from this instability. It was this volatile chemical reaction. Right? You had Hollywood Rose with Axl Rose and Izzy Stradlin, who were childhood friends. And then you had LA Guns, which was guitarist Tracy Guns' project. You mashed those two together, and yeah, the combination was totally electric, but it was also just inherently combustible from day one. Which brings us to how they were formed. Look, this band wasn't put together in some record label boardroom. It was forged in fire. I mean, a series of just disastrous events and truly awful living conditions created this bond that, honestly, it was less like a band and more like a gang of survivors. And it's wild how fast that classic lineup, the one we all know, actually came together. It was pretty much by accident. Right before their very first tour, there were these huge disagreements, and poof, Tracy Guns and the original rhythm section were out. In their place stepped three guys who would become absolute icons: Slash, Duff McKagan, and Steven Adler. I mean, this chaotic last-minute scramble pretty much set the tone for everything. And that first tour, the one they called the Hell Tour, man, it was a logistical catastrophe. We're talking days after forming, their car breaks down on the highway. They end up having to hitchhike over 1,000 miles to Seattle. They have zero money for food, so they're literally surviving by raiding onion fields. And when they finally get there and play the show, it's on borrowed equipment, and they get paid a measly $50. But here's the crazy part. According to Slash himself, that whole ordeal is what cemented the band. It created this collective resilience. See, it wasn't about success at that point. It was purely about survival. That one disastrous trip is what turned them from 5 separate guys into a single unit, with this powerful us-against-the-world mentality. And that survivalist thing, it did more than just keep them together. It directly fueled their art. The sound of the jungle, you could call it. The raw, authentic sound you hear on their debut album. That wasn't some calculated choice. No, it was a direct, unfiltered reflection of the harsh reality they were living. When they got back to LA, they ended up living in this rundown rehearsal space they nicknamed the Hell House. I mean, it was basically a garage with no plumbing, no kitchen, and when they rehearsed, they didn't have a PA system, so they played at these extreme volumes. Axl literally had to scream his lyrics just to hear himself over the band, and that's how he developed that signature vocal grit. And the stuff they wrote about, the addicts, the dealers, the crime, that wasn't fiction. That was just their social environment. It was their daily life. And right at the center of this whole storm, you have Axl Rose. You have to understand, his whole personality was a reaction to this just architectural level of trauma. He was subjected to severe domestic abuse. He grew up in a fundamentalist household where secular music was literally forbidden, destroyed as satanic. He was forced to go to church up to 8 times a week. So yeah, he developed this deep, deep hostility toward any kind of institutional authority. His famous, or infamous, need for absolute control in the band, it was a defense mechanism born from a life where he had absolutely zero control. So when they finally get a record deal, the producer, Mike Klink, he knew exactly what his job was. His mission was just to capture that raw live energy, to capture that lightning in a bottle. He took this no-nonsense approach, focused on what you'd call sonic authenticity, a dry, raw sound that felt like you were in the room with them. It was the complete opposite of all that polished, reverb-soaked glam metal.
Okay, so now they have this masterpiece on tape. But here's the thing, success was anything but guaranteed. The story of how they became the biggest band on the planet is this incredible tale of a slow, ignored climb, followed by a sudden, massive explosion. I mean, check this out. When Appetite for Destruction first came out, it debuted on the Billboard charts at number 182. 182. It was a total commercial flop. Radio wouldn't play it, MTV wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
But then, a whole year later, an executive at their label basically begged MTV to play the Welcome to the Jungle video just one time. They agreed to play it at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And that's all it took. Everything changed. Within hours, it became the most requested video on the entire network. The album just skyrocketed to number 1. And just like that, Guns N' Roses was the biggest band in the world.
And with that explosion of fame came this immense pressure. And that dangerous label, it became a reality fast. And I'm not talking about press hype. We're talking real-world consequences. At the Monsters of Rock festival in '88, 2 fans were tragically crushed to death during their set because of the crowd surging. A few years after that, the infamous Riverport riot happens when Axl jumps into the crowd to attack a fan with a camera, leading to 60 injuries and hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage. The chaos wasn't an act. It was very, very real, and it was escalating.
And this, right here, is the central tragedy of the whole story. The very same things that made them so great, the chaos, the defiance, the reaction to trauma, those were the exact same forces that basically guaranteed their implosion. It was a ticking time bomb. So you had this core conflict just ripping the classic lineup apart. It was these 2 competing, totally destructive forces. On one side, you've got Slash, Izzy, and Steven, who are sinking deeper and deeper into heroin and cocaine addiction. And on the other side, you have Axl, who's retreating further into isolation and demanding absolute, total control over every single thing. So the collapse of that classic lineup happened in stages. First up, Steven Adler, the drummer. He gets fired in 1990. His heroin addiction had gotten so bad he literally couldn't play his parts in the studio anymore. Then, just a year later, Izzy Stradlin, who many people call the creative soul of the band, he just quits. He had recently gotten sober and he just couldn't be around the constant chaos and Axl's increasingly erratic behavior anymore. But even with the classic lineup completely falling apart, the impact of what they created, well, it was permanent. They left this dangerous legacy that absolutely altered the course of rock music forever. Just think about this number for a second. 18 million. That is how many copies Appetite for Destruction has sold in the US alone. To this day, it is still the best-selling debut album in American history. That's just incredible. But the GNR footprint, it's so much bigger than just record sales, right? They completely defined the rock and roll look for a whole generation. You know, the bandanas, the leather jackets, the tattoos, that became the uniform for millions. And musically, their sound was this perfect, gritty bridge between the over-the-top excess of the 80s and the raw, authentic angst of the 90s grunge scene that came right after. They basically made it cool to be real and raw again. Which kind of leaves us with this big, final question to think about. Can true, dangerous art actually survive global fame? I mean, the story of Guns N' Roses proves that squalor and trauma can create something incredibly powerful and authentic. But it also really suggests that maybe, just maybe, that kind of art, that kind of danger, simply can't survive the massive machinery of global fame that it inevitably creates.